Well, as promised, by way of a difference today, we're going to look at Justice on Trial. Now, that's a book written by Chris Daw QC, a barrister, a senior barrister, a Silk, as they're known, Queen's Counsel, who specialises in the criminal law. He has for well over 20 years now. But he doesn't agree with the penal system, he doesn't agree with all the prisons that we've got, and he thinks, too, that drugs should become legal. In other words, there should be a method of getting the drugs that people require through a legal method. Or bluntly, putting it another way, putting the drug dealers out of business. Now, barristers are often seen as people who have been brought up through a schooling system of the public schools onto top universities and then into the law. But what about Chris himself? Does he have that background?
No, not me. I grew up in Milton Keynes, where not many people are overly proud of, I guess. But no, I grew up in Milton Keynes. My dad was a builder. My mum worked in John Lewis and other department stores and went to a very ordinary comprehensive state education all the way through. So none of those cliches apply to me, although I have to say they are rather sadly too prevalent in my line of work, even now.
Even now, you say? Has that not changed a little?
No, not really. I mean, it might have changed a little, but there's still something like 40% of barristers went to private schools, as against roughly 7%, I think, of the whole population. So a massively disproportionate number of privately educated barristers are still around. Although it is changing gradually. I do a lot of work myself to get into schools, speak in schools in deprived communities and try and encourage young people to become lawyers or to follow their dream, whatever that might be, in education or otherwise, because I think the more of us that do that from backgrounds like mine, the more difference we can make.
But your main line is representing people in the criminal law courts. And I think the topic we're going to be talking about today, some people might think, and dare I say, that you're almost like a turkey voting for Christmas in what we're going to hear next.
Well, that's my plan. I want to make myself unemployed, because if I'm unemployed and there's no need for criminal defence lawyers, then we must have cracked crime, because there won't be any crime left. So, yeah, obviously, I appreciate that's unrealistic and we're never going to get zero crime. The less you need people like me, it's rather like, the cancer surgeon. They're a necessary part of our lives, but we'd rather they didn't exist. I'm in the same boat. If you don't need criminal lawyers, then society's a happy place.
Now, let me just put this to you. You heard the intro I did there, and I talked about politicians. Priti Patel was in our studio not very long ago, saying that you're going to get harder on crime, bigger sentences, fine deterrent words. You would not agree with that, I don't think, would you?
Oh, don't get me started on Priti Patel. Oh, well, you have. Okay, so the truth of it is that in the last 20, 25 years, while I've been a criminal lawyer, sentence levels have gone up and up and up. The average length of sentence that people are serving in prisons has never been higher. The prison population has almost doubled in that time, so we now have over 80,000 people in prison, and it was around 40,000 when I became a barrister in the mid-1990s. So all the things that she's saying we need more of, we've already had, and we already had in spades, and it doesn't work. So you've got to do something different, right?
Yeah, you may be saying that, but every political party, all right, we've had a go at Priti Patel there, whenever it gets, here's the manifesto, lock them up, put them away. Probably said the same words as myself. Oh, that's so awful. Put them away. Throw away the key.
Well, as you know, I've written a book called Justice on Trial, and in that, one of the chapters is called Why We Should Close All the Prisons, because the fact of the matter is, as I just said, we've been using prison more and more for more and more people, and yet people are still saying, rightly, that in the case of more serious crimes and sexual crimes and violent crimes and murder on the streets, it's getting worse and worse. So using prison more and more, locking them up and throwing away the key, which, as I say, we've been doing more and more for decades, is not working. It's the medicine that's killing the patient, and the patient is our society, and we need to try some new medicine.
Let's go from a patient to a man you described. You used a different name, obviously, in the book. I think it was Michael. Michael was more at home in prison than he was outside. That doesn't strike me as a particularly clever achievement by anybody.
Well, it's not, and you're absolutely right. So that was a client of mine, and the facts of the case in the book are pretty much true to the real life. As you say, I've only changed the name and not much else. But yeah, he had been in prison for around 30 years, on and off, for non-violent crimes, drugs, and stealing from shops to pay for drugs. And by the time I came to represent him in his early 50s, he'd spent nearly 30 years in prison. And I remember saying to him, why do you keep committing these stupid crimes? And he said, I'm okay in prison. It's the only life I know, and I don't know how to live on the outside. And that's what prison is doing to people. People often have got mental health problems, serious addictions, and other issues in their lives. And prison becomes a place of safety, even though it's horrific. And prisons are not holiday camps. They're awful places to spend time. But people get institutionalised, and we're doing something seriously wrong when we keep institutionalising people and spending more and more money, public money, money and your listeners' money to make crime worse.
We have listeners we know who are in prison. Now, rolling that back, the arguments sometimes given, not by them, but by governments, is that they can do degrees in prisons. Is that reality?
Well, some can, but the point is, most of them will be better off doing education in the community, as part of the community, with everybody else, because by alienating people and placing them in an environment which is so different to normal life, we effectively set them up to fail. They can get all the degrees in the world, but if they walk out of prison, they've got nowhere to live, they've lost contact with their family, they have to declare their conviction on every job application, so no one will give them a job, then unsurprisingly, that most of them, and it is the great majority of people who come out of prison, degree or no degree, will end up committing more crime. So do we want our prisons to be universities of crime that churn out worse and worse criminals and have worse and worse outcomes? If so, we're doing the right thing and we need to do more of it. But if we actually want our criminal justice system to reduce crime, reduce the number of mothers who get a knock on the door from the police saying, "I'm sad to tell you that your son's been stabbed," which I've met mothers in that situation and I don't wish it on anyone, obviously. But if we want to reduce those knocks on the door from the police and those terrible, tragic pieces of news to grieving parents, then we need to do something dramatically different, as I say in the book, on all different fronts of our approach to punishment, to crime, to prisons, to drugs. And in particular, one of the points I make in the book is around children and young people. We need to not be sending them into dangerous prison environments from often the age of 13 and 14, which does happen.
Hey, let me unravel that and let me see if I can understand this rightly. You're not sounding like a woke liberal there too much. You're actually sounding as if you want the people who are affected by crime to face less crime because people don't, if you like, study at the university, get a doctorate in crime while they're inside there.
Exactly. So I tell the story of a young man in the book who was in and out of a bit of trouble in his teens and up until about the age of 20. He eventually was given a prison sentence after he was basically homeless and had been in care and so on, as many people in prison have. And in prison, he was first exposed to heroin and became a heroin addict in prison whilst under the custody of the state. And B, he learned all about how to become a career criminal and drug dealer from other career criminals and drug dealers. So he came out and then spent the next 15 years or so in and out of prison and committing crime on a daily basis. And all of that has a direct impact on ordinary members of the public, your listeners, who are going about their business and don't want to get robbed and burgled and don't want to have their children attacked or even worse, killed in the streets. So I'm not a woke liberal at all. I'm interested in real results and getting action so that we can reduce crime and make our country a happier and safer place. And that's what the whole book is about. It's not about being soft on criminals. Using like cracking down and all of that are just tabloid and political headlines and soundbites. They mean nothing. They get us nowhere. What we need is real action to change things for the better.
Of serious crime, and we're talking a real serious crime. You're not suggesting you shouldn't send a serial killer to prison or anything like that. I'm sure that you're not going that far. But how many people are locked up, incarcerated, their lives changed, sometimes ruined, that haven't committed that type of offence?
You're right. It's in the book. No, not in huge detail, because the book is meant for general readers, people who are just interested in good, juicy crime stories. There's plenty of those in there. But I do give the figure. It's 69% of those in prison are in prison for non-violent crime. So they haven't harmed anyone. They haven't assaulted or attacked someone or raped or physically robbed somebody. Many of those, that 69%, are in there for drug crimes, including even possession of drugs, and they are serious habitual drug addicts and drug users. And many of them are in there with very serious mental health and addiction and other problems, as I said, and they need help and support, because if they don't get it, then they are going to carry on being addicted to drugs. They're going to carry on having serious psychotic illnesses which are untreated. And sadly, people in that situation do end up committing more crime. It's only probably around 10 to 15% of the whole prison population who have committed serious violent acts and represent an ongoing daily risk to the public. Those people need to be kept in secure conditions. They can't be allowed to walk the streets, obviously. But even they, almost every one of them, will be released one day. So there's only about 60 or so prisoners in the country who will never be released, the terrorists. But there's only a handful of whole life prisoners. The great majority, even murderers, even rapists, will be released one day. So what you want to do as a member of the public, I would have thought, is say, when they're released, we don't want them to reoffend. We want to make them as safe as possible. And at the moment, our prisons are failing to do that. They're making the problem worse.
Well, in a moment, we're going to address the criminal law system more and whether those prisons, as many prisons as we've got, and all those custodial sentences are really necessary. We're listening to Chris Daw QC, and we'll hear again from him right after these. Returning now to Chris Daw QC and what's in his book, which is Justice on Trial, we're talking about prisons, where he's saying a lot of them should be abolished and the money used elsewhere to try and keep people, if you like, out of prison and keep people safer that are affected by crime at the moment. We're also going to be talking in this section about drugs. But let's continue. Now, when somebody goes to prison, as it exists at the moment, we're building more, I think. I remember some years ago at Armley Prison in Leeds, you were stuffing them in the front and they were falling out the back almost.
Well, they still are. Most prisons are overcrowded, something like 60%, and some of them are way over capacity, massively overcrowded, 2 people in a 1-person cell and beyond. And if you keep people in those conditions, you turn out angry people who are angry at society. And you're right, unfortunately, this government has decided that rather than doing something sensible, like looking at how we can reduce the prison population, which is ultimately a good thing if we can, they're looking to just fill more and more prisons and build more and more. And of course, that creates more and more profit for private companies that often run these prisons.
Now, you've created the hurdles. They're there now. Lots of prisons, lots of politicians looking for votes. I'm sure some of them mean well. Boris Johnson's been recently saying people should be punished more. What's your solution to the problem? And how likely is it real?
Well, there's a whole range of very straightforward solutions that are set out in very simple terms in my book. So one of them is that we stop criminalising children from a very young age, because at the moment a child of 10 years of age can be called a criminal, can be prosecuted and can be placed before a criminal, and within a year or two can end up in a quasi-prison environment. And our young offenders institutions, I describe them, they're feral places where young people are killing each other and killing themselves at ridiculous levels. So we stop treating children that way, and we look to introduce a welfare and education model for children, which is incredibly successful in other countries where it's done, and I talk about that in the book. We need to stop criminalising drugs and prohibiting drugs, because that causes catastrophic damage to our society, causes thousands and thousands of deaths from overdose, including of young children, and I talk about some of those tragic cases in the book of young girls killed from taking drugs that were obtained from dealers, which were dangerously unsafe in their level of concentration. And we need to just stop this addiction to prison, because prison achieves only one thing. The more you use prison, and America uses it more than anywhere, they have 2.5 million in prison almost in the US, which I describe as the city of incarceration in the book, and I visited prisons there in Alabama and give graphic descriptions of how horrific the conditions are. But the more we use prison, the simple fact is the more crime we end up with. So if people want to follow the Boris Johnson pretty for sale rhetoric, vote for it, and then you'll get more crime, and sadly there'll be more of those mothers who will be receiving those knocks on the door from the police. But that's not what I want. I want fewer victims of crime, fewer murders, and I want our streets to be safer, and that's what I'm arguing for with all of these fairly simple but very important and radical reforms.
But what about the fact of a deterrent? Surely if somebody fears that by committing the crime they could have to do the time, that might deter, doesn't it?
It never does, and it never has. So the prime example is the United States I've just mentioned, where they have life without parole, even for relatively minor drugs offences in some states, where they have the death penalty in most US states, where sentences are incredibly high, where you can get 50 or 60 years for fairly trivial things, and yet they have astronomical levels of violent crime in America, as everybody knows. They have tens and tens of thousands of murders, as against our total of round about 1,000 or so homicides for the whole country in a year. So the more that you bandy around these tough on crime messages, all you do is you create a group of people in your society who are almost permanently in prison. And in the US and here, that is disproportionately made up of black and minority ethnic communities, because policing is disproportionately aimed and targeted at those communities, mostly in the cities. You end up with a 2-tier society. You have them and us. And when you have them and us, the others, the them, will end up being your enemy. And what you need is to make everybody part of our society and make everybody included in our society, and only use the most serious sanctions when people are seriously violent and seriously dangerous. And even they, you need to work with them, because unless you want to have a prison population of 500,000, which would be what we would have if we had an equivalent rate as the US, if you want a standing army of 500,000 criminals locked up all the time, then let's go down that route. But I promise you there will be war on the streets if that's the situation. There will be no deterrent, and there will be more and more criminals.
There'll be people who say that your thoughts on legalizing drugs I mean, goodness gracious, I mean, that smacks immediately of thinking, OK, anyone can go and put a syringe in their arm, they can have cannabis, it's perfectly all right. I mean, what do you mean by that?
I don't mean that at all. I mean that you would license and legalise and regulate drugs in the same way as we do with alcohol. I'm sitting here at home looking at a rack of very nice gin bottles on the shelf. That won't probably surprise anyone. And there's a nice bottle of whiskey there too. Well, all of those products on my shelves tell me exactly what's in them. They tell me how much alcohol there is. I know if I choose to have a drink of one of these drinks, which I occasionally do, I know exactly what I'm putting in my body. With drugs, nobody knows what they're putting in their body. People take drugs in massive numbers. Millions and millions of people take drugs every week, every month, every year. But they don't know what they're taking. And that's the tragedy. And also, the other very serious tragedy about our current prohibited drug market is that it's run by criminals, by definition. And criminals are dangerous and violent people, and yet we've let them take charge of a very profitable business, which is never going to go away. We've had drugs, as I say in the book. I go back 200 million years in the book, our early ancestors before modern humans even evolved. And they were taking psychoactive substances from plants 200 million years ago. Every society since time began, people have taken drugs, including alcohol, including cannabis, including opium and various others. And they will continue to do so. I'm just saying, let's make it safer for the people who choose to do it. And let's not have young women like Martha Fernbach, who I describe in the book, 15-year-old girl who took 91% pure MDMA and died on a Saturday afternoon in Oxford because she had no idea what she was taking. And that's a human tragedy, and we shouldn't have any more of that.
Now, how would you answer the fact that I know it's in the book, which kept me up all night reading, I have to tell you, you owe me for that. But at the same time, how do you account
Did you get a free copy, though?
I didn't, actually. I paid for it. I couldn't.
Oh, well, that's even better. Then I do owe you.
When it's free, it's more difficult to criticise it sometimes. But let me say to you, Prohibition. In the States, you talked about whiskey, gin, the gangster world that really benefited from the fact that people not being able to drink, wasn't it?
The Prohibition, as everybody knows, I mean, it's so famous, there's been so many movies about it. Prohibition in the last century in the US, which lasted for a decade or so, it was the birth of organised crime as we know it. The mafia in the US, as soon as Prohibition came in, they were absolutely over the moon because it meant that they suddenly had this hugely profitable market. And drug dealers in our society, some of whom are okay people, many of them who are not, are nasty, violent people, they are the one group of people that is most opposed to the legalisation of drugs. So when you ask yourself this question, am I in favour of legalisation, consider this. The people that you fear the most, the people who are likely to have gang wars on the streets and shootings and stabbings and exploit children in county lines, drug dealing, etc., the illegal drug dealers and the prohibited drug dealers, they're the ones who want to keep it like it is now. Because that's how they make their living, and that's how they destroy so many of our communities. If we had a legalised, regulated and licensed market, they'd be out of business for good. And we'd empty our prisons by at least 50%, and we would have a safer, calmer and happier society. And the evidence is clear, before you ask me, that it does not lead to more people taking drugs. It just leads to fewer people dying of overdoses, dying of infections and other diseases associated with drugs, and it leads to a massive fall in drug-related crime. Burglaries. Your listeners, many of them will sadly have been woken up in the morning and found their house has been ransacked by burglars. Well, those burglars will almost all be looking for a small amount of money so they can buy today's fix from a dealer. If you make it a legalised and licensed market, those burglaries don't happen anymore. They'll stop almost completely. So there are so many benefits to legalisation of drugs, and there are no downsides. I've travelled the world. I've seen the licensed and legalised markets where they exist. I've seen legal heroin supplied in places like Switzerland, and they have almost no overdoses and almost no drug-related crime. And that's what I'd like to see in Britain as well.
Chris Daw QC, who is a criminal barrister with over 20 years' experience in the law, his suggestion is that there are less prisons and also that drugs should be legalised. But do any of his colleagues in the legal profession, any of the judges, do they agree? Let's find out more right after these. Well, my special guest on Mansfield 103.2 talking about the justice system today has been Chris Daw. He's a barrister, as we know, who specialises in the criminal law, defending people who have been charged and in many cases who, if either pleading guilty or found guilty, will be sent to prison. He accepts that there are people who need to be in prison because they have committed very, very serious crimes. But he thinks it's not always appropriate and can do more harm than good for society in general. I joked earlier with you about being a turkey voting for Christmas, trying to make you destroy your own defence profession that you've been in for so many years. Let me ask you pointedly. You will rub shoulders in robing rooms and courts with many other barristers and solicitors. Are there others that share your view?
There are, and many have contacted me since I've written the book and have appeared on a number of other media outlets since the book came out over the summer, and many have contacted me. I've had retired judges sending me emails saying, completely agree with you, what can we do about it? I've had a number of MPs who have contacted me and asked to meet up and discuss some of these ideas. There are politicians who are broad-minded and perhaps, brave enough to consider looking at alternatives. The great majority of my colleagues, I think, at the bar and in the criminal legal profession would agree that the use of prison, the increasing use of prison, has been a damaging thing for our society, and that the way in which drug crime is enforced and the way in which the drug market is prohibited is largely responsible for much of the crime in our society. So it's very interesting that you asked that question around colleagues, because I made a series for the BBC earlier this year, which people can still watch on iPlayer. It's called Crime, Are We Tough Enough? On the BBC iPlayer. It was a 5-part series, basically me advocating my side of the argument on these various issues, and we were looking for a retired police officer or someone in law enforcement to come and argue against me. And we couldn't find anyone, because retired police officers who have spent their life, 30, 35-year careers in senior policing roles, all said, well, we agree with Chris. We agree the whole thing's a mess and doesn't work. We agree that prison and drug policy and the way we treat children doesn't work. So we couldn't even find police officers to argue with me, never mind people who are on the defence side of the argument. I think everybody in the system, from top to bottom, knows that it's broken. It's just that politicians get votes from members of the public by saying, let's crack down and get tough. Nobody really stops for long enough to think what that means, but what it means is you make crime worse, and that's what's been going on in our society now for far too long, and it needs to change.
Will it change? Is it likely to change? It isn't, is it?
I don't see any sign of it, sadly. I'm certainly not on the Conservative side for the reasons you've given. I don't see much evidence of a great deal of interest. I mean, as I say, a number of politicians, including some Conservatives, to be fair, have contacted me wanting to start a dialogue around some of these issues. But in terms of real policy change and someone saying, let's dramatically reduce the use of prison, let's dramatically change our approach to children, particularly children in the care system, many of whom sadly end up in the criminal justice system because we're not looking after them properly in the care system, and the approach to drug policy, in terms of concrete changes of law, changes in the way the world is going to run, I don't see any evidence of that happening anytime soon. And it's a deep tragedy for everybody who's out there trying to make an honest living and not wanting to be the victim of crime or get caught up in the crossfire of drug gangs and so on, which happens in so many towns and cities.
I speak to many barristers in the criminal profession. It's dying, isn't it? Criminal barristers are leaving in droves.
Yeah, and have been doing for many years now, since the Ministry of Justice was the largest percentage cut during the austerity round of the late 2000s. 40% in cash terms, so much bigger in real terms, cut in the justice budget. That meant huge reductions in the number of police officers. That meant massive reductions in the budget for various rehabilitation programs. And critically, it meant an enormous reduction in the funding for the criminal court. So many criminal courts are sitting empty. Many barristers just don't have enough work, and therefore, as you say, are leaving the criminal bar and going to much more lucrative areas like commercial law and property and various other kinds of highly paid specialisms. So we are absolutely, I'm afraid, seeing the death of criminal law as a profession, as a working environment. The massive impact that has, first and foremost, is on justice in our society. We are seeing delays. I'm advising 2 women at the moment. This is a tragedy beyond belief. 2 women at the moment who are complainants in rape cases, and they're having to wait 18 months or more for the case to come to trial, if not 2 years for the case to come to trial. And they are sitting at home, frightened for their lives, and the system is absolutely at a standstill. And victims of crime at the moment in our society have never had a worse deal. It's an absolute tragedy for our society, and I absolutely hope none of your listeners are the victims of crime. But if they are, I'm sure they'll have the same experience of delay after delay, lack of communication, and it's an absolute disgrace what we're doing to our criminal justice system.
I have to ask you, and you forgive me, it's a low baller coming in, wait for it. You're not the secret barrister or the guy who's just written fake law, are you, as well?
I'm not. I don't know who the secret barrister is, but I'll give your listeners a clue. I think the secret barrister is a woman.
Ah, why?
Because she, in my opinion, is far too sensible to be a man. Measured, calm, lack of ego, expressing opinions in quite a nuanced and sensible way, not getting combative and aggressive. Seems that it's much more likely to be a woman than a man. A man would have much more of a loudmouth like me.
Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining Mansfield 103.2. I know that a lot of people will be listening with great interest. They may not always agree with you, but you certainly open another side of this. Now, are you going to become more of an author and broadcaster now? Are you leaving the criminal law?
Fortunately, there are a number of people out there who have legal problems and sufficient money to pay for my services all over the place. But I am planning on doing more writing. I am planning on another TV series, possibly one connected to the book. I am very active. We'll talk about the social mobility side. I work with charities a lot. I have a YouTube channel, Chris Daw QC, which has lots of content for young people who are looking at legal careers, so people can have a look at that. And I'm always on Twitter giving my views at CrimLaw UK. So anyone wants to hear my opinions, they can go on Twitter and they'll get a good stream of invective.
Chris Daw QC, who certainly makes you think, do we need just as many prisons as we've got? Should so many people be put away? And what would happen if drugs were legalised and then the dealers wouldn't have the market they've got? And I can unhesitatingly say, whether you agree with what he says or whether you don't, his book, Justice on Trial, is certainly worth a read. Well, let's just test the argument of Chris Daw, the barrister there, with Peter Jones, who was the Detective Chief Inspector before he became Mansfield 103.2's police correspondent. What does he think? First of all, on the prisons, are they as awful as has been suggested?
The prisons are overfull, and they've been overfull for the last 20-odd years. So whoever's in government has never built enough prisons. They're all Victorian jails in the main, and they're obviously not built for the number of people that they've got in.
So lesser offenders shouldn't be sent to prison then? Is it fair to send them?
Yes, because if you didn't commit crime, you wouldn't have to go to jail. So it's self-inflicted punishment.
So putting aside the very serious offences, when you've done your investigation when you were an officer, and they went through and they went to prison in the lesser type of crime, do you accept they were almost going to a learning institution for the University of Crime?
Well, that depends on the individuals. I can think of some who it did actually impact on quite significantly, and they became model people afterwards. And these are people who had served several years. So it all depends on the individual. But some of them get into a life of crime because they've been involved in drugs, and although you can usually get it in prisons, there's also rehabilitation units in prisons, so they can be helped and cured.
Peter, how do you feel about Chris Daw, the barrister's argument there, the QC, who's saying he believes that prison should only perhaps be used for the most serious of crimes and lesser crimes could be dealt with in other ways?
It's one of those chicken and egg things. How can you tell that people are going to turn out like that until you've tried it? And as I say, I can think of a number of people where prison has actually been a benefit to them.
But let me put the counter argument to you. Do you also know people who you put away, literally, came before the courts and went to prison, who then turned out even worse and you met them again?
Yeah, but that's perhaps because there's not the support that people need. It's all right actually kicking somebody out of jail and just saying, right, now live your own life. They've got to have some support when they've been institutionalised.
Doesn't that invite the argument support should be there before they get put into prison?
That would be ideal. That's an ideal world, but whether you can ever find a government of any description that would be prepared to spend the money to do that.
Mansfield 103.2's police correspondent Peter Jones. Well, moving on to sport next. And who better to go to for that than Mansfield 103.2 sports editor Jason Harrison.